It was the sound that woke me soft, deliberate, the echo of a bell striking somewhere beyond the city walls. Not the great carillons of Christchurch or Magdalen, but a smaller, lonelier chime, the kind that feels less like a call to prayer and more like a reminder that something, somewhere, has ended. Rain had been falling all night. The streets of North Oxford shimmered beneath the lamps, the reflections of bicycle wheels slipping through puddles, students hurrying home from the pubs, their laughter thinning into mist. I remember standing at the window, listening. I had the faint sense that the bell was tolling for something I had not yet lost. Lewis arrived at 8. His shoes squeaked as he came into my office, the same apologetic sound every Monday morning. "There's been an incident, sir," he said, though he didn't need to. He always looked faintly embarrassed to be the messenger of unpleasantness, as though the world's crimes were his to apologize for. The incident, as it turned out, was at St. Simeon's College. A porter had discovered a man slumped over a desk in one of the smaller reading rooms of the senior library. Dead. No sign of violence, no forced entry, and no reason apparently to be there at that hour. The only thing out of place was an overturned teacup and a single sheet of music paper, blank except for a few penciled bars of an unfinished fugue. I had walked those corridors before. St. Simeon's was not one of the wealthier colleges, and its silence always seemed somehow threadbareless the peace of learning than the exhaustion of having nothing left to learn. The librarian recognized me, of course. Most of them did. She led me to the room without a word. The air was stale, the windows still locked from the inside. The late 50s, thinning hair, academic gown folded neatly beside him might have been asleep, were it not for the faint, bluish tint of the lips. The teacup bore the pale rim of cream, the scent of bergamot. I remember thinking that he must have been a man who appreciated small refinements. Lewis stood by the door, awkward in the stillness. "Heart attack," he murmured. "Possibly," I said, though his eyes were still open. People rarely die neatly at their desks with such a look of expectancy. I noticed the music paper again. It was placed not in front of him but to the side, almost as though someone else had been seated opposite. A second cup? No, only the ring mark of one, faint and circular, just beginning to dry. In the corner of the room, the old grandfather clock ticked unevenly. Every few seconds it hesitated, as if doubting its own mechanism. I bent closer to the fugue, 4 bars, tentative, hesitant F minor, if I wasn't mistaken. And then nothing. But the pencil lay across the margin as though interrupted mid-thought. The librarian spoke at last. "His name is Dr. Anthony Miles," she said. "Tutor in theology. A quiet man, very musical, I believe. Lately he'd been working on a paper about the ethics of confession." Confession. I turned the word over in my mind. There was something faintly liturgical about the scene, the desk like an altar, the teacup a chalice. I asked when he'd last been seen alive. Yesterday evening, perhaps after hall. "He often stayed late," she said. "Said he thought better when the bells had stopped." I left Lewis to arrange the removal of the body and wandered into the cloister. The rain had stopped, but the flagstones were dark with moisture, the air dense with petrichor and the faint sweetness of ivy. Across the quad the chapel door stood ajar. I went in. Candles burned low before the lectern. Someone, perhaps a student, was playing the organ, softly, imperfectly. The same 4 bars as on the paper, repeated, then abandoned. F minor, a fugue that went nowhere. I waited for it to resolve, but it didn't. It simply dissolved into silence. The sound of that bell returned, carried faintly through the rafters. I found myself thinking not for the first time that Oxford hides its sorrows with an almost professional elegance. Death here is seldom sudden. It arrives like fog, gradually, politely, and only once you've stopped believing it might. Later that evening, back in my flat on Jericho Street, I poured myself a small measure of Glenlivet and opened Miles's file. He had no enemies I could find, no debts, no scandal. But his paper, half finished, bore an epigraph from Augustine. Confession is not for the ears of others, but for the silence of one's own soul. Somewhere beyond my window, the bell tolled again. Once, then twice, then nothing. And I couldn't help but think it was not only for him. I have often thought that the smallest objects carry the most unmanageable truths. The grand gestures of life, the letters, the speeches, the funerals are merely excuses for avoiding them. A key, for instance, is a curious thing. It promises entry, but speaks more eloquently of exclusion. It was the following morning when Lewis told me about the key. He'd been through Miles's pockets in the presence of the college bursar, a methodical man who handled both death and ledger entries with the same antiseptic efficiency. Among the usual debris coins, a handkerchief, a railway ticket to Banbury, there was a small brass key attached to a faded strip of green ribbon. It was unmarked, old, and slightly bent at the tip, as though used for a lock that no longer wished to turn. Lewis had placed it on my desk as if afraid it might accuse him of something. "Any idea what it opens, sir?" he asked, his tone carrying that blend of curiosity and apology I'd come to recognize as his method of moral hygiene. I turned it over in my palm. The metal was cold, clean, no tarnish, no rust. Used recently, I thought. Perhaps last night? I didn't say so aloud. There are times when silence keeps a man nearer the truth than talk ever could. At St. Simeon's they knew nothing of it. The librarian shook her head, the bursar frowned, and the chaplain offered a kind of unctuous smile that meant he would say more if only his conscience were a little less vain. In the late light of morning, the reading room already seemed smaller, the air too neat, as if death had tidied itself away after use. The teacup was gone. So was the fugue. Only the ring mark on the desk remained, pale and circular, like the ghost of a thought unfinished. I ran my finger over it and felt, absurdly, the same faint chill that accompanies certain memories one cannot quite place. Lewis had been questioning the porter. Miles had left his room shortly before 8, carrying a small leather case. He had locked the door behind him and said he was going to the library for an hour or two. Nothing unusual in that, the porter had said, except that Miles usually left his key with him, college rule. This time he had not. So that was it. The key had been in his pocket all along. The lock he'd used was therefore not his own. Back at the police station, I spread his few belongings across my desk. A small notebook filled with quotations, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Donnea silver pen, the railway ticket, Banbury, a place he had no reason to visit. Unless, of course, the reason was precisely what made it worth hiding. I circled the date on the ticket. 2 days before his death, a single journey, no return. The key glinted faintly under the desk lamp. I tried it idly against the drawer, against the filing cabinet, even the small lockbox, where I kept the more regrettable parts of my past life. It fit none of them. It wasn't meant to. Later, walking through the cloisters, I passed a young man tuning the organ. The same hesitant bars drifted out again, F minor, uncertain, searching. I paused. He told me, without being asked, that Dr. Miles had been teaching him counterpoint, said he was composing something about forgiveness, said he never finished it. Forgiveness. The word settled uncomfortably on my tongue, as though it had been left there by someone else. Outside, the bell began to strike at noon. I looked up to the college tower and for a moment saw the faint outline of a figure at one of the high windows, motionless, indistinct. Then gone. Perhaps only my reflection in the rain-dulled glass. I slipped the key back into its envelope and sealed it with a paperclip. There was no evidence yet, no crime even, only the sense, familiar, persistent, that meaning was hiding just out of sight, like music behind a closed door. And somewhere, beneath all the logic and procedure, I could feel that this small brass key had already turned in more than one lock. There is something untrustworthy about the purity of choral music. Beneath its harmonies, one can often hear the tremor of pride, of sin disguised as devotion. Perhaps that is why I have always preferred silence to worship silence, at least has the decency not to pretend. It was in the chapel of St. Simeon's that I heard the first confession, though not in the form the church would recognize. The choir was rehearsing for evensong, their voices ghosting through the stone like half-remembered prayers. I had gone there to speak with the chaplain, a man whose faith had survived his sense of humour, but little else. He greeted me with a deferential weariness, the look of someone accustomed to burying more secrets than souls. He told me that Dr. Miles had recently withdrawn from his usual duties, no sermons, no tutorials, no dinners in hall. Said he had grown increasingly abstracted, distracted by something unnamed. He had spoken of guilt once, vaguely, over sherry in the vestry, but not the sort that earns forgiveness. The chaplain had assumed it to be the usual variety: academic vanity, private temptation, perhaps even love. Oxford breeds all three with unholy consistency. As the choir began to sing, I recognized the melody immediately. F minor, the same unfinished fugue. The young organist, the one who had mentioned Miles's lessons, was playing again tentatively, like a man walking barefoot over glass. The notes reached upward, then fell away, unresolved. I felt, absurdly, as though the dead man was still composing from the other side of the wall. The chaplain noticed my distraction. He said Miles had once kept the keys to the choir loft. No one else uses it now. A relic of his private meditations, he called it. I asked if I might see it. The stairway was narrow, the steps worn hollow by generations of forgotten piety. Dust lay thick along the balustrade, undisturbed except for one small patch where a hand had recently brushed against it. At the top, a heavy oak door. I tried the handle, locked, and then I remembered the brass key. It turned easily, almost gratefully, as though it had been waiting. The room beyond was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of candle wax and mildew. Against one wall, a wooden bench. On it, a leather-bound hymnal, its spine broken from use. And beneath the bench, a shallow metal boxhold, unremarkable, secured by a simple clasp that required no key at all. Inside were letters, dozens, perhaps more, folded, refolded, stained at the edges by time and fingertips. Some bore the seal of the college, others the faint perfume of another life. I read only a few, fragments of a correspondence that began in admiration and ended in ruin. A woman's handwriting is elegant, self-assured, and fatally honest. She wrote of a promise, of regret, of music that had once bound them together and then betrayed them both. Lewis found me there, standing in the half-light like a man caught between curiosity and trespass. He asked if it was a clue. I told him it was something rarer. He frowned, not unkindly, and left me to it. I sat for a while on the bench, the choir's voices rising faintly from below. A psalm, I think, though I could not tell which. Through the music came a whisper of deduction, the faintest alignment of pattern and purpose. Miles's fugue, his confession in code, mirrored the structure of the letters. 4 voices, interweaving then breaking apart, Each entry is an echo of guilt answering itself. But guilt for what? Love, perhaps, or betrayal, or the kind of sin Oxford forgives only in retrospect. As I locked the door behind me, I caught one last note drifting upwards high, uncertain A held too long. The sound trembled, then vanished into the stone. I realized then that Miles had not been writing about God at all. He had been writing about himself, and perhaps in some quiet, unguarded way, about all of us who listen too closely for meaning in other people's silences. Scholarship, I have often thought, is the most delicate form of vanity. It cloaks its hunger in footnotes, its rivalries in modest prefaces. Oxford, in particular, excels at the art of concealing ambition behind diffidence. Perhaps that is why the most dangerous sins committed here are intellectual rather than physical. 2 days after finding the letters, I went to see the bursar. He had summoned me rather than the reverse, an inversion of protocol that hinted at irritation or fear, though he was too discreet to betray either outright. His office, lined with glass-fronted cases of forgotten prizes, smelled faintly of brass polish and age. He gestured toward the chair opposite, as though welcoming a visiting creditor. He had heard, he said, that I had been examining certain private papers belonging to the late Dr. Miles. He hoped, for the college's sake, that discretion would prevail. There was no scandal after all, merely a man who had taken his work too seriously. Too seriously? The phrase lingered. I asked what work he meant. The bursar hesitated. Theology, of course, but also music. Miles had been researching the moral philosophy of harmony, the idea that divine order could be expressed through contrapuntal balance. A strange fusion, he admitted, but not without precedent. I said that I'd found his fugue unfinished. The bursar smiled thinly. Perfectionists often die mid-sentence, he said. There was a pause then, long enough for the clock on his mantel to assert its authority. I noticed on the desk before him a bound volume of the college journal, open to a recent essay bearing Miles's name, or rather, not his name exactly. Beneath the title in smaller type was the phrase with contributions from Dr. P. Ashby. Ashby, I knew the name, a fellow in philosophy younger than Miles, clever, impatient, and ambitious enough to disguise it poorly. I asked about him. The bursar looked almost relieved. Ashby was brilliant, he said, a mind like a scalpel. He and Miles had collaborated, though not perhaps harmoniously. There had been disagreements over authorship, citations, the usual academic trivia that occasionally produces murder in everything but name. When I left the office, Lewis was waiting by the gate. He'd been speaking with one of the college servants, a woman who remembered seeing Dr. Ashby near the library the night Miles died. He'd said he was returning a borrowed book, but there was something odd about it, she thought. He hadn't gone through the main door. He'd entered by the side staircase leading to the choir loft. I looked across the quad. The rain had started again, the spires blurring into the sky like dissolving ink. It was one of those moments when Oxford seemed less a city than a palimpsest, each life overwriting another in faint, stubborn layers. Later that evening in my flat, I found myself turning once more to the letters. They spoke of shared research, shared secrets, and a shared woman, though her name was never written. Only an initial E. Each letter circled back to the same refrain music as absolution, harmony as penance. It struck me then that the fugue's missing resolution, its refusal to close, might not have been failure but intention, a confession interrupted, or interrupted by someone. I poured a measure of whiskey, the last in the bottle, and let the amber light catch on the rim. Somewhere outside, a bicycle bell rang faintly in the rain. It reminded me, absurdly, of that first toll from the college tower, the sound that had begun all this. Scholarship, I thought again, is a polite word for rivalry. Miles's paper on confession had been due for publication the following week. Ashby's on moral aesthetics the week after. Two versions of the same argument, written from opposing convictions. The bursar had said there was no scandal. He was wrong. The scandal was already in print. Lewis, in his clumsy wisdom, had once told me that clever men rarely kill out of anger. They kill because the truth threatens to make them ordinary. I didn't answer him then, but as I stared at the faint pencil marks of Miles's unfinished fugue, I realized he might have been right. The melody began again in my mind, four voices interweaving, breaking apart, each seeking resolution and finding only silence. I could almost hear the faint scrape of a chair, the closing of a door, the turning of a key. And I knew, without yet knowing how, that this was not a matter of theology at all. It was a matter of scholarship. I first saw her that afternoon outside the Bodleian, walking beneath a canopy of chestnut trees that were already beginning to shed their leaves. She carried her books close to her chest, as if guarding something private, and when she turned, just briefly, her eyes caught the light in that way I have come to associate with people who have lived too much and spoken too little. Her name, as I later learned, was Evelyn March. She taught English at Lincoln College. It was Lewis who brought her to my attention. He had traced the initial E in the letters to her, a small act of deduction that, though accidental, carried the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. Dr. Miles and Miss March had co-authored a paper some years before on the moral ambiguity of Milton's Paradise Lost. It had not been well received, though for reasons unrelated to scholarship. Some whispered that the collaboration had extended beyond the page. Others whispered louder. I found her in her rooms at Lincoln, surrounded by a dishevelled kind of order. Books arranged by emotion rather than alphabet, a single vase of tulips drooping toward the floor, and the faint scent of bergamot that linked her, inexplicably, to the dead man's teacup. She offered tea. I declined. It felt indecent to repeat the gesture. She asked, without hesitation, if I was there about Anthony. Few people used his first name. There was a gravity in her voice, grief not yet dry, not yet ready to become memory. I told her only that I was trying to understand him. She smiled at that faintly and said understanding him was rather like trying to fold a piece of music back into silence. We spoke for an hour, perhaps more. She told me that he had been working on something personal, something he refused to share with her after a quarrel. She had accused him of intellectual theft, borrowing too liberally from her earlier lectures. He had replied, she said, that truth was not a possession, merely a form of arrangement. I wrote the phrase down later. It had the ring of someone trying to justify both plagiarism and love. At one point she looked toward the window where the rain had begun again, tracing faint trails down the glass. He was frightened, she said softly. Not of death, but of what might survive him. I asked if she meant reputation. She shook her head. No. Memory. There was something in that pause that unsettled me. I noticed, too, her hands ink-stained, restless, and yet too clean for the story she was telling. A single ring, silver, worn smooth by habit. As she spoke, she turned it absently, the way a guilty person rehearses honesty. Before I left, I asked about the music, the unfinished fugue. She seemed startled, though not entirely surprised. Yes, she said, it was his. But it wasn't unfinished. He'd written the rest in his head. He said the final note would only be struck when he was sure of something. Sure of what? I asked. She didn't answer, or perhaps she did in the silence that followed. As I walked back through the drizzle toward Radcliffe Square, I kept thinking of that room, the faint perfume, the symmetry of the books, the tulips dying with such unstudied grace. There was beauty there, and guilt, though I could no longer tell which was which. Lewis met me outside the Sheldonian. his collar turned up, his expression as bleak as the weather. He said they'd found something new among Miles's things, a torn page from an earlier draft of his essay. In the margin, one line has been underlined twice. Confession is not always voluntary. I thought of the way Evelyn March had turned her ring, the tremor in her voice when she said his name, the fugue that had never quite resolved. There are moments in every investigation when logic falters and one is left with only instinct, the faint sense of symmetry between human frailty and design. As the rain began to fall harder, blurring the spires into shadow, I felt that symmetry narrowing, drawing me towards something I wasn't yet prepared to see. And somewhere beyond the rooftops the chapel bell began again. The door was never locked in the usual sense. It resisted rather than refused. A quiet, stubborn kind of resistance, the sort that comes not from metal or wood, but from history. Lewis had called me early that morning. His voice still carried the reluctance of a man who would rather let mysteries lie where they were found. The college porter had discovered a small antechamber adjoining the old choir lofton that had been bricked up decades before and recently reopened for renovation. The bursar wanted me to see it. I suspected he wanted me not to. When we arrived, the chapel was still in shadow. Dust rose in thin columns where the first light of morning slipped through the high windows. The air smelled faintly of wax and lime wash. A carpenter stood by, cap in hand, looking guilty for having found anything at all. He pointed toward the newly exposed door, a dull panel of oak, slightly warped, its surface streaked with a film of white powder from the plaster around it. Lewis tested the handle, once, then twice. It turned freely, but the door refused to move, swollen with damp perhaps, or something heavier. I told him to leave it. Instead, I knelt and looked closer. The keyhole had been painted over, but beneath the paint was a faint indentation mark that did not quite match the pattern of the door. A circle, imperfect, as though something round and metallic had once hung there. A key! The key! I reached into my coat pocket and felt the familiar chill of brass. The one we'd taken from Miles. It fits with the kind of precision that makes logic seem preordained. The lock turned smoothly, but when I pushed again, the door still refused. I told Lewis to fetch the carpenter's chisel. He hesitated, then obeyed. The wood gave reluctantly, sighing as it did, like an old man forced to wake. When the door opened, the air that escaped was stale, heavy, tinged faintly with something else, oil, perhaps, or ink long dried. Inside was a small chamber, scarcely large enough to stand in, a desk, a chair, a candlestick melted into itself. And on the wall opposite, a row of thin wooden pegs, each bearing a single object, a college gown folded neatly, a bundle of manuscript pages tied with black ribbon, and above them, tacked to the plaster, a scrap of music paper, the missing continuation of the fugue. Lewis said something astonished, perhaps, but I barely heard him. The notes were written in pencil, hurried, almost frantic. A progression from F minor into E major, the key of resolution. The fugue was complete after all, but the handwriting changed midway through. Two different hands, uneasy partners in composition. I examined the manuscripts, sermons, drafts, correspondence, all bearing the initials of both Miles and Ashby. At the bottom of one page, in faint graphite, a single phrase, "Truth must be shared, even if ownership cannot." Lewis asked if it meant plagiarism. I said no, it meant confession. There was another thing. The desk drawer was jammed. I pried it open with the chisel and found a small glass bottle, half full of a viscous amber liquid. Belladonna tincture, if I wasn't mistaken. The sort of poison one might keep in an apothecary cabinet, or use in very small quantities to calm the nerves. In larger quantities, it silences them permanently. Lewis looked at me, waiting for certainty. I gave him none. Death in Oxford is rarely a simple matter of dose. As we left the chapel, I turned once more toward the door. It swung slightly on its hinges, as though breathing after years of confinement. There was a kind of reverence in its stillness, the dignity of something that had been forced to keep a secret too long. Outside, the rain had stopped. The cobbles were slick, reflecting the spires like fragments of another inverted city. I felt the faintest chill along my spine, the recognition that we had not opened the door so much as disturbed its silence. And somewhere behind us, the air seemed to close again, not quite a slam. More like the soft, deliberate sound of something finally locking itself once more. It was the sound that troubled me most, not the melody itself, but the space between its notes, the hesitation, the small fractures in rhythm that made the familiar seem deceptive. The choir had been rehearsing again that morning, the same piece that haunted the college these past weeks. F minor, shifting uneasily toward E major. The fugue that had begun with Dr. Miles and ended, perhaps, with his silence. I sat in the back pew, listening. The organ filled the chapel with that strange, brittle grandeur that only sacred music can conjure, too beautiful, too severe. The organist was the same young man I'd met before, a student named Haynes. His playing was competent, but there was something practiced in his imperfection, as though he were trying not to be noticed. When the final chord died, I asked him how long he'd known the composition. He said it wasn't written by Miles, at least not entirely. He'd been given the sheets by Dr. Ashby, who told him they were part of a study in harmonic morality. The phrase struck me as the kind of conceit philosophers use to hide emotion behind abstraction. Lewis, standing beside me, looked puzzled. He whispered that perhaps Ashby had stolen it. I told him that theft and authorship are the same act in Oxford, only the footnotes change. Later that day, I found Ashby in his rooms overlooking the Radcliffe quadrangle. His walls were lined with books, spines facing outward like soldiers. A gramophone sat on the table beside an empty glass and a score of the same fugue. He seemed tired, though not from work. I asked about the music. He smiled, polite, academic, faintly contemptuous, and said it was the culmination of a collaboration. Miles had begun it, and he had completed it. Truth, he said, requires two minds in dissonance. The words lingered. Two minds. Dissonance. The same language Evelyn March had used when she spoke of her quarrel with Miles. And yet, in Ashby's tone, there was no grief, only ownership. I noticed a framed photograph on the shelf. A college dinner 3 years past. Miles, Ashby, and Evelyn seated together at the high table. Her head turned slightly toward Miles, his toward her. Ashby's gaze, however, fixed on neither. It was the kind of look that measured distance rather than affection. He caught me studying it. He said that everyone in Oxford confesses eventually, whether to a priest or a policeman. The difference, he added, is that one expects forgiveness. There was no accusation in his voice, yet I felt one. I asked him what had happened between them. He said only that some partnerships decay the moment they discover equality. He poured himself another glass, though he didn't drink it. As I left, a detail stopped me. The gramophone's needle still rested on the record, but the disc wasn't turning. A small act of neglect, or perhaps reluctance to refuse to let something finish. Outside, dusk had softened the spires into shadow. Lewis walked beside me, quiet, uncertain. He asked if I believed Ashby. I said belief was a poor substitute for understanding, but even as I spoke I felt the unease growing, a sense that the music itself was the confession, that the fugue's final transition from minor to major was not resolution, but deceit. When I returned to my flat that night, I played the recording we'd found in Miles's chamber. The same fugue, though recorded crudely, on a reel. Halfway through, the second theme entered too soon, clashing against the first. False harmony, a deliberate discord, and beneath it, barely audible, the sound of a door closing. I stopped the tape and sat for a while in silence. Somewhere beyond the city, a bell tolled 8 times, each strike bleeding into the next. I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the reflection of the room ripple faintly in the glass. It occurred to me then that perhaps the entire case had been written in counterpoint to the living answering the dead, one confession echoing another until meaning itself dissolved into noise. And yet even amid the dissonance, one note still lingered steady, unresolved, insistent. The sound of something unfinished, waiting for the ear that would finally recognize it for what it was. It was Lewis who found the photograph, folded neatly inside the back cover of a hymnal from the chapel library, one of those heavy, leather-bound volumes whose pages smell faintly of mildew and memory. He'd brought it to me with a kind of reverence, as though afraid it might fade in daylight. It showed the choir of St. Simeon's, taken perhaps 5 years before. A neat row of faces arranged beneath the carved oak screen, every expression softened by formality. At first glance it was unremarkable, one of those institutional portraits that Oxford seems to breed endlessly. But something about it refused to sit quietly in the mind. There was Miles, of course, standing toward the end of the second row, his features already carrying that austere calm that would later pass for serenity. Beside him, almost hidden by the edge of the frame, Evelyn March. Younger, sharper, her gaze directed not at the camera, but at someone just outside it. And in the front, seated with an almost defiant ease, Dr. Ashby. His hand rested on the arm of the chaplain, a gesture that looked casual until one noticed how the chaplain's own hand had tensed, half withdrawn, as if caught off guard. I studied it under the desk lamp for a long time. Something about the composition troubled me, the alignment of the figures, the balance of light and shadow. It was a tableau of civility, yet every face seemed to belong to a different scene. Lewis, patient as ever, asked what I saw. I told him I wasn't sure yet, but that sometimes the past arranges itself like a crossword, the answer already present, waiting for the right clue to unlock it. He frowned, muttered something about pictures never helping much, and left me to it. Later, alone in my flat, I returned to the photograph. There was a faint smudge on the right edge, as though a thumb had pressed there repeatedly over time. Beneath it, in tiny, faded handwriting, someone had written a single word, Cecilia. Not a name I recognized, not a choir member, not anyone in the college records, but the name carried with it a faint echo, something from the letters, perhaps. I remembered one of Evelyn's early notes to Miles. She had mentioned St. Cecilia's Eve the night they first met after a concert. The phrase had seemed harmless then, merely romantic. Now it glimmered with something sharper, like glass catching light. Cecilia, the patron saint of musicians, the one said to have sung to God even as she was dying. The kind of metaphor only an academic would make literal. I took the photograph back to the college the next morning. The porter recognized most of the faces, except one, a woman at the edge, blurred, almost an afterthought. He thought she might have been a visiting soprano, someone from Lincoln College brought in for a term. He remembered she left abruptly. No forwarding address, no explanation. In the choir loft, the organ pipes loomed above like organs of some sleeping beast. I held the photograph up to the dim light filtering through the stained glass. The blur around the woman's face began to make sense. It wasn't a flaw of exposure, but motion. She had turned her head at the last instant, away from the lens, toward Miles. That turning the smallest act was enough to rewrite the meaning of every other expression. Ashby's composure now looked like watchfulness, Evelyn's downcast eyes, guilt. Miles, between them, appeared no longer serene, but trapped, as if aware that the harmony surrounding him was only prelude to dissonance. Lewis arrived then, his shoes squeaking, faintly, on the flagstones. He asked if I thought the photograph mattered. I said all evidence matters, even the kind that pretends to be art. He laughed softly and said it was just a picture. But even as he spoke, I noticed something else beneath the choir stalls, a glint of glass, a small frame, fallen, its backing warped with damp. Inside it, the same photograph, cropped differently. The woman at the edge was missing. Someone had edited her out. When I looked again at the faces that remained, I realized the true composition had always been one of subtraction, the removal of a single figure to restore balance, the illusion of peace after discord. Oxford, after all, understands the necessity of omission better than most. That night, I placed both versions of the photograph side by side on my desk. One whole, one incomplete. And between them, the faint hum of a harmony that had never truly existed. The false harmony. The one that had fooled them all, perhaps even me. There is a particular stillness that comes when truth begins to surface, an almost physical quiet, as though the world holds its breath for fear of what it might overhear. I felt it that evening at St. Simeon's just before the chaplain confessed. He had sent word through the porter, a brief note in that careful clerical hand. I believe I may have misled you, Inspector. Perhaps it is time I spoke plainly. I went alone. Lewis was still convinced the matter would resolve itself without revelation, though he didn't say so aloud. He rarely did when I'd already made up my mind. The chapel was dark, except for a single lamp burning near the lectern. The smell of polish and damp hymnals filled the air. The chaplain sat in the front pew, his collar unfastened, his hands folded like a man rehearsing penitence. He didn't rise when I entered. He only said, almost to himself, that guilt was easier to bear when it could be mistaken for duty. I sat beside him. He told me he had been the last to see Miles alive. That much, at least, was true. Miles had come to him late that evening, agitated, his voice trembling between argument and prayer. They had spoken of confession, not the ritual kind, but something more personal. Miles had wanted to unburden himself of a sin that was not entirely his own. He'd said there were others involved. He'd said he was afraid. The chaplain paused then, his gaze fixed on the candle's slow collapse. He said he'd offered comfort, not counsel. That he had advised Miles to rest, to pray, to let the soul find its own absolution. When I asked what the sin had been, he hesitated. Then, as though it were an afterthought, he said it was love. Love is always the most convenient explanation because it demands neither evidence nor clarity. He insisted that Miles had been in despair over Evelyn March, that she had ended their liaison, and that he had taken poison out of remorse. He had seen the empty bottle himself, he said, near the desk, before panic had driven him, to conceal it, to preserve what dignity remained to the dead. I asked where the bottle was now. He said he had thrown it into the Cherwell that same night. A tidy confession, perfectly shaped, like a sermon composed for the forgiveness of the self. But there was a small problem, yet enough to make the whole story tremble. The bottle we'd found in the hidden chamber had been corked, not empty, and the key to that chamber had been locked inside Miles's pocket. So how, I asked quietly, had the chaplain seen what no one else could have reached? He didn't answer. His hands, folded so neatly a moment before, began to shake. He said he had been mistaken, that the bottle must have been somewhere else, that memory plays tricks. But it wasn't memory that betrayed him. It was a sequence. In Oxford, time behaves like an unreliable witness. Days overlap, events blur, and people convince themselves that what should have happened did. But deduction, like faith, depends on order. The key in the pocket, the locked door, the sealed bottle. A pattern impossible to ignore. He rose then, slowly, and said he had done what he thought was merciful, that the truth would serve no purpose now. I told him mercy is a poor disguise for fear. He smiled faintly, as if relieved to hear it spoken aloud. As I left the chapel, the air had grown colder, the mist curling through the cloisters like smoke from a dying fire. I could hear, faintly, the choir practicing again, the same fugue, its melody drifting upward, the dissonance between voices now more pronounced. The false harmony had become something raw, human, uncertain. Lewis met me outside. He asked if the chaplain had confessed. I said he had, though not to what he believed. He frowned. To what then? To the wrong thing, I said, and sometimes that's worse than silence. Later, in the quiet of my room, I poured a whiskey and stared at the photograph once more. 3 faces remained: Miles, Ashby, Evelyn. And behind them, the blurred figure of the chaplain, half in shadow, half erased by the light. Perhaps, I thought, there is no right confession in a place like this. Only the ones that sound convincing enough to be believed. It was raining again that evening, the sort of fine, lingering rain that seems less like weather and more like a memory returning uninvited. I had been sitting alone in my flat, the file on Miles spread open before me, when the call came through. The porter from St. Simeon's sounded frightened, though he was trying hard not to be. The chapel door, he said, the old one, near the loft, the one you opened last week, spirits open again. I remember looking at my glass of whiskey, still half full, and thinking how much of life is merely repetition in disguise. I told him not to touch anything. 10 minutes later, I was on my way. The college was nearly deserted, the term had ended, and the courtyards lay silent beneath a thin mist. My footsteps echoed through the archway, the sound unsettling in its precision. There is something about old stone that records sound like a confession it holds on to, even after the voice has gone. Lewis met me at the porter's lodge, his coat unbuttoned, hair damp from the drizzle. He said he'd already checked the main door to the chapel. Locked from the inside. Only that one door to the loft was open. I asked if anyone had been seen entering. No one. But the porter swore he'd heard the organ earlier, just for a few bars. The light inside was dim. The air had that faint sweetness that follows the extinguishing of candles. The loft steps groaned under our weight as we climbed. When we reached the top, the door yawned inward as if waiting for us. The small chamber beyond was exactly as I remembered it, bare, airless, a desk, a chair, and the faint scent of decay that clings to places where purpose has long since ended. But something was different. The manuscripts that had once lain on the desk were gone. In their place sat a single page, folded neatly. Lewis hesitated, then handed me his torch. The light caught the paper like a sudden breath. It was a letter written in the same hand as the fugue, but steadier, more deliberate. Addressed simply to whoever listens rather than hears. I read it once, then twice, though it revealed almost nothing. A meditation on guilt, on harmony, on the futility of owning truth. The final line lingered. A confession must be heard twice, once by the ear and once by the conscience. Only one can forgive. Lewis asked if it was from Miles. I said yes and no. The phrasing was his, but the ink was new. We searched the rest of the chamber. The faint outline of dust on the desk suggested that several items had been removed recently. Papers, perhaps a book. On the floor, a damp footprint curved back toward the stairs. It was smaller than mine, narrower, the heel slightly worn. A woman's shoe, I thought. I told Lewis to find Evelyn March. He hesitated. She's already gone, sir. Left Oxford this morning. Said she had lectures in Cambridge next term. So the fugue, the photograph, the confession had come full circle. And yet, nothing felt complete. A crime without a corpse, a confession without a sin. I stared again at the page in my hand, to whoever listens rather than hears. A phrase that sounded less like apology than instruction. We sealed the chamber again, though I doubted it would matter. Some doors, once opened, remain so if not in wood and iron, then in the mind. Later that night I walked alone by the Cherwell. The rain had stopped, but the river carried the residue of its small circles, spreading endlessly outward. In the lamplight I saw the faint shimmer of something caught against the reeds. I knelt and fished it out. A small brass key, tarnished by water, its ribbon faded to grey, the same key, or its twin. Lewis would say it proved nothing, but I have learned that the smallest objects hold the loudest echoes. Someone had returned to that chamber to close a circle that was never truly open to begin one that would not end. Back in my room, I placed the key beside the letter and poured another whiskey. The city outside was quiet, save for the distant hum of bells. I listened not to their rhythm, but to the silence between them. And I realized, with the reluctant clarity that arrives too late to be useful, that every case I have ever solved has ended the same way, not with justice, but with the faint sound of a door opening again, somewhere in the dark, where no one is left to listen. Perhaps that is the closest we come to truth. Not discovery, not closure. Only the awareness that something, somewhere, continues to turn the key. There are endings that arrive with ceremony, prayer, applause, and there are those that slip into the air unnoticed, like the faint chime of a bell long after its clapper has gone still. The conclusion of the St. Simeon's affair belonged to the latter. It was 2 days after the door had opened again. The rain had gone, leaving behind the kind of brittle sunlight that flatters nothing. Lewis sat across from me in the station, his notebook open, his pen motionless. He asked if I thought it was truly over. I told him, not unkindly, that I no longer believed in such things. We had found no trace of Evelyn March, not in Cambridge, not in Lincoln, not in any of the neat, well-documented places where respectable lives are meant to continue. The bursar maintained his unconvincing calm. The chaplain withdrew to some retreat in the Cotswolds, and Ashby, ever the philosopher, published a paper titled On the Ethics of Collaboration, which received precisely the sort of acclaim one expects when sin is dressed as intellect. The fugue was performed once by the choir at Evensong. I attended, though I stood in the back, unannounced. The piece began in the familiar minor key, but this time something in it had changed. The dissonance that had once unsettled now seemed deliberate, necessary. The final chord resolved not into triumph, but into stillness. Lewis, standing beside me, whispered that it was beautiful. I said it was incomplete. As the congregation filed out, I noticed the porter, the same one who had called me about the door. He approached, awkward, deferential. He said they had found something that morning near the river bank, a notebook, damp, half-ruined, but legible enough. Miles's handwriting, though the last pages were written in a different hand. I took it home that night and read it by lamplight. The early entries were lectures in miniature snatches of theology, reflections on confession and forgiveness. Then gradually the tone shifted. Notes about the fugue, about a shared voice that must be allowed to speak twice. And finally, near the end, a single line in the delicate script I recognized from the letters, "He will forgive himself when the music ends." It was signed with one initial. I closed the book and sat for a long time, listening to the faint ticking of the clock, the soft breathing of the city outside. The truth, I realized, was neither hidden nor revealed. It was simply unfinished, like the fugue, like the confession, like every human attempt at absolution. The following morning, I returned to the chapel alone. The air was cold enough to make my breath visible. I unlocked the side of the same one that had resisted before and stepped inside. Dust shimmered in the light from the clerestory, like ash suspended in silence. The chamber beyond was empty now, even the desk had been removed, but the faint imprint of the manuscripts remained on the wood, as though the pages had left behind a shadow of themselves. I stood there, remembering Miles's words from that first day, the ones quoted in his unfinished essay. Confession is not for the ears of others, but for the silence of one's own soul. Perhaps that had been his final act, not to ask forgiveness, but to create a space where it might exist. When I left, I didn't lock the door. It seemed unnecessary. That evening, back in Jericho, I poured myself the last of the Glenlivet. The city was quiet, the cobbles slick with recent rain. Somewhere across the spires, a bell began to follow, deliberate, familiar. I thought of Miles, of Evelyn, of all those whose voices had blended briefly into the same imperfect chord before vanishing into silence. Lewis had asked once if I believed in redemption. I'd told him no, but perhaps that had been a lie. Perhaps what we call redemption is simply the refusal to let meaning decay entirely, to listen even when the music has stopped. I raised the glass, though not in a toast, only in acknowledgement of Oxford, of the case, of the peculiar mercy that sometimes lingers in incompletion. Outside, the bell fell silent, and in the pause that followed, I thought I heard, just faintly, the echo of a chord resolving itself at last, a quiet benediction carried by the wind through the narrow lanes of the city. Then it was gone.